today for Haunted History, we're going to talk about Ann Coleman and the house that she was given as a graduation present from her parents, Robert and Ann Coleman. Her mother was also named Ann. And we're going to talk about the tragic love story between herself and James Buchanan and what wound out leading to a ghost story that happens to be at what was the Inn 422, I think is now Masiago restaurant. It's a really neat restaurant there in Lebanon. It's actually right across. We just visited the Coleman Chapel. It's somewhat cat-a-corner across 422. But anyways, Ann Coleman was given this as a graduation present. She had studied at Dickinson College and had just graduated with a law degree. And she had come back to Lebanon, Pennsylvania. And where the Lebanon County Historical Society is now, that's where she had her law practice. She had met a young man named James Buchanan at Dickinson College. They had gone about the same time. And he had come to Lebanon. He also had an office in Lancaster where he practiced law. I believe he was district attorney in Lebanon County at that time. And a romance came about. And unfortunately, this was one of those romances that was not okay. Back at that time period, the wealthy families, which the Coleman family were one of the wealthiest families, the most well-renowned, the families back then would sort of set up marriages between wealthy families. Now, because of their common interests, James Buchanan and Ann Coleman, it would have been a match most likely made in heaven. It would have been perfect. But James Buchanan's family had just recently immigrated from Ireland. And I guess the Coleman family, Robert Coleman, they knew the Buchanan family over from there. And James Buchanan also did not have a very good reputation at Dickinson College. So he had actually, I guess, getting kicked out at one point because of bad behavior. And Robert Coleman got him readmitted and he graduated, but he just was not, the family had not really accomplished anything in the New World. So it was something that would have been scandalous in the time. And it would have been very offensive to the Coleman family. So when they found out that Ann was romantically involved with James Buchanan, Robert Coleman had the rights back then to end an engagement, which he did, which led to an emotional confrontation with Ann that would end tragically. Now, there's two more versions of the events. One is that Ann heard that James had visited a former lover, which turned out to be just a completely mistaken situation, if that's what happened. He was giving her legal advice. She was married and stuff like that, and that was all it was. He tried to explain it, and I guess he explained it to the father. They never told her because they wanted the relationship to end. Well, that whole thing wound up backfiring. The other one is that he wrote a letter to her to end the relationship, which that doesn't sound like that is either. It's probably one of the other first two. It just is sort of how they did things, and it makes the most sense. Well, anyways, what happened, unfortunately, Ann was distraught because James Buchanan was the love of her life. She went down to visit her sister in Philadelphia, and I believe it was December 19th, or in that range. I just looked at it. It was December 19th, 1819. She took an overdose of laudanum and basically fell asleep, never woke up, died, so she killed herself. And, this is one of those tragedies. And weirdly, her sister actually did the same thing. I'll have to, when I do the Coleman series, investigate that a little further, reasoning and that type of stuff. But it was a horrible event. So, it left James Buchanan. He basically pledged to never have a relationship with anyone ever again because Ann Coleman was the love of his life. So now where the ghost story comes in to play is when the folks that bought the Inn 422, which it wasn't Inn 422 at that time, but the place had really fallen into disrepair, and they fixed it up, took it back to the colonial times, and the building itself, I think it's only the front section is the original part of the house that was built right in that time period, like 1815, 1816. they fixed it up and they realized there was something going on there. It's a little weird, spiritual, ghostly, whatever it was. So the one room is 202. Apparently that is Ann's favorite room because they believe the ghost of Ann Coleman is there on the property. Because they'll have all kinds of weird things happen. I think the lady had said the one time, the housekeeper, she had been making up the bed in 202, and there was like a human-shaped air pocket in the sheets. And she, no matter how much she tried to like push it out, it just wouldn't go. And she finally was like, okay, Ann, you can have the room. She left the room. She came back maybe 15, 20 minutes later. The bed was perfectly made. No air pocket, nothing. And there was no other housekeeper, so nobody else could have done it. So it was just weird. She had another time she was carrying a bucket of warm water, and somebody, as she was carrying it, somebody tipped it over in her hand, and there was nobody around. She said there'll be times that where you have cold air hit you all of a sudden. Just weird things like that. And the other one is eerie and has to be freaky. There's, at the top of this wooden spiral staircase, there's a mirror. And I said, every now and then, out of the corner of your eye, you'll see a young woman that looks just like Ann Coleman in the mirror smiling. And there's another spirit there, they say, as well, that could potentially be there as a little boy. But the spirits aren't, nasty or anything. It's more, being stinkers, just sort of messing with people. But they said, it's like, well, why would Ann's spirit or ghost come to this place? Well, it was the place where she was happiest. It was a beautiful place where she knew the love of her life, and so it makes sense. But yeah, I mean, that is the story of the N422. There's a lot of different places like this that they have sort of these weird ghost stories and things like that. But it's a tragic story about what happened to Ann and to James Buchanan. But it is interesting. And another one of note, too, I'll say, there's actually two more stories. Sorry. There's a guest that was very frequent back in the late 90s, and he was a man who had lost his leg, and he would have his artificial leg sitting next to the bed, and he said it would just, nobody came into his room, it would be on the other side of the room the next day. And then the other one I say is really weird. If you ever go there to do like photographs and stuff like that, your cameras will just go blurry and you can't take photos sometimes. It's just really bizarre. So it's a really neat place. It's a cool place to eat. It's not the N422 anymore. I think it's Masago Inn now, or restaurant, and I believe Japanese cuisine. I could be wrong about that, but it's a really neat place, and it's just sort of weird because it's out of place because it's a building set back in time, really. And they did such a beautiful job with it because you got car dealerships on the one side, and I think there's like a parts store next on the other side or something like that. So it's just sort of there. It's a peek back in time, in late colonial period style building, and a lot of cool history with it. Weird ghost stories. We're gonna do a couple more of these, but it's a lot of fun. And as always, thanks for coming along, and we will see you all about town.